It's a cold autumn night, that time of year when the wind whistles softly through the cracks in the doors. Just to remind you that you shouldn't be walking the deserted village streets this late. But here you are, stubbornly, with your threadbare coat and a hunger strong enough to defy any meteorological warning. After all, who needs caution when you can follow the irresistible aroma of freshly baked bread and warm beer, lazily escaping from the half-closed windows of an old tavern? You slowly push open the wooden door, which protests with a sleepy groan, probably annoyed at being opened for the 1000th time today. And there it is. You're immediately greeted by a warm cloud of smoke and a confusing mix of voices, muffled laughter, and music played by a slightly out-of-tune lute in the left corner of the room. The acrid smell of burnt grease mingles with the sweet aroma of honey, creating a combination capable of awakening your stomach and disturbing your lungs at the same time. Yes, this is the authentic medieval experience. Uncomfortable, aromatic, and curiously comforting. You walk through the crowded room, dodging with some difficulty the exaggeratedly gesturing arms, raised cups, and chickens that insist on running loose under the tables. Sitting on a rustic bench near the fire, probably occupied earlier by someone who gave up the fight, against sleep and now snores peacefully under the table, you finally take a deep breath, feeling the scorching heat caress your cold hands. It's almost cozy enough to make you ignore the fact that several unclassified species have probably inhabited this table since time immemorial. But relax, after all, hygiene was never exactly a priority in the 14th century. A tired-looking woman, with a half-absent smile and an apron that's clearly seen better days, approaches to take your order with a look that suggests her patience ran out around noon. You order what everyone else seems to be having, the house beer, a murky drink that probably has never been formally introduced to the concept of filtering. But you don't really mind, since alcohol has, historically, that almost magical ability to make everything a bit more tolerable. The beer arrives quickly, in a chipped clay mug that you seriously suspect has taken part in a few epic brawls right here in this hall. Speaking of epic brawls, it's curious how the habit of raising your glass before drinking feels so natural today, isn't it? Legend has it that this tradition, affectionately known as a toast, was born right here in medieval taverns. Originally, the gesture was quite practical a way to splash some of your drink into your companion's cup, ensuring no one was trying to poison anyone. Obviously, no one guarantees that this explanation is actually true, but what medieval story can be told with absolute certainty, right? As you raise your mug in honor of those ancient and suspicious drinking companions, you take the first sip of the beer, feeling the dark liquid slowly slide down your throat, with a flavor delicately balanced between sweet, bitter, and dubious. It may not be the best taste you've ever experienced, but it's definitely unforgettable. Your gaze now drifts around the room, observing unfamiliar faces, sharing stories aloud. That was the magic of taverns, a place where strangers quickly became friends, united by questionable food and even more suspicious drink. A sort of medieval social network, but with far fewer filters and a lot more food poisoning. You realize that this gastronomic universe can be charming from a distance, but let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last a day eating this way. However, if the medieval culinary adventure hasn't put you to sleep yet, don't worry, there are many more food stories to explore. While the fire slowly turns wood into ashes, and your consciousness begins to slip gently into that sweet in-between state of awake and asleep. As you sink a little deeper into the rough but cozy bench, take a moment to reflect on how food is, at its core, a door to the past, a bridge connecting generations, flavors, and stories. And who knows, if you manage to stay awake long enough, you might even whisper a word about that medieval food you'd never dare to try. And maybe, very slowly, almost like an unassuming thought, even consider signing up for this nighttime journey through history. But no pressure. After all, it's no longer the 14th century, and you already have enough on your plate. And so, as the flames crackle, you settle in even more, allowing the medieval world to slowly fade around you. making room for dreams that, hopefully, don't involve leftover stew or suspicious mugs. You wake up slowly, your face stuck to the rough wooden table, still with a slight residue of medieval beer at the corner of your mouth. Last night's fire is now nothing more than a sad pile of cold ashes, and the lively voices of the tavern have given way to the quiet murmur of those facing the day with that familiar medieval resignation. Suddenly, a peculiar aroma invades your nostrils, an undefined mix that simultaneously awakens your hunger and your instinct for self-preservation. Lifting your head requires monumental effort. Maybe the beer wasn't quite so innocent, or maybe it's just the overall 14th century atmosphere taking its morning toll. Either way, you look around, trying to figure out what exactly constitutes breakfast in a medieval tavern. And, spoiler alert, there's no avocado toast or espresso coffee in sight. Instead, in front of you is a plate of dark bread, so solid and compact it could easily double as a brick in a modest construction. It's accompanied by a bowl of something hot and vaguely liquid, whose smell vaguely recalls a combination of cooked onions, leftover vegetables, and maybe something that might once have been meat. You hesitate, casting a wary glance at the woman in the dirty apron who once again passes by, wearing that expression that blends maternal sympathy with complete indifference to your fate. "Bon appétit," she says, as she leaves a full mug beside you with a pale golden liquid, possibly diluted beer, or some kind of unidentifiable tea. After all, the concept of clean, drinkable water still isn't exactly popular here, and no one wakes up early to boil water when you can simply drink beer. Medieval priorities, of course. You take a deep breath, face the hard bread again, and decide that you need to dip it into that mysterious soup if you're to have any chance of chewing without compromising the structural integrity of your jaw. Upon taking the first bite, you realize you may have underestimated medieval genius. The bread, after a few seconds of soaking, gains a bearable texture, and the soup's flavor isn't as offensive as it had promised. It's almost comforting, if you completely ignore the origin of the solid bits now lazily floating in your bowl. Speaking of culinary mysteries, you've probably heard of this morning's soup before, an improvised mix of the previous day's leftovers, a sort of medieval gastronomic recycling that functioned both as household economy and food lottery. No one's absolutely sure of the original recipe, since apparently no medieval cook thought it relevant to document with precision something that could vary so wildly day to day. Not exactly the kind of recipe that makes it into historic cookbooks with thrilling detail, though it might deserve a whole chapter on creativity or desperation. As you chew slowly, feeling unrecognizable chunks sliding down your throat, you hear a few people quietly chatting at the next table. Something about the difficulty of finding good flour this time of year, and how bad harvests were more common than ideal. Ah, yes, welcome to the permanent cycle of medieval food uncertainty. In fact, fresh bread was as rare as good news, and the dark, coarse bread you're trying to swallow now is the perfect symbol of that somewhat sad, but very true reality. But of course, you don't have to worry too much about that, because you're only visiting this era, and you've clearly realized that you wouldn't survive even a day sticking to this diet any longer than necessary, especially when you consider that medieval breakfast rarely included conscious vegetarian options or alternative sources of protein. There were no green smoothies here, and the only chia likely grew on the damp roofs of huts. In fact, it's impossible not to think that medieval life required a strong stomach and a very practical attitude toward food. Nothing could be wasted, because there were no guarantees about tomorrow. And hunger, let's face it, is a powerful seasoning, capable of turning even the most dubious recipes into something acceptable. As you finish your modest medieval breakfast, you realize with a mix of relief and fascination that you're already starting to get used to the feeling of constant digestive uncertainty. Maybe your body is more resilient than you thought, or maybe you're just delirious from a lack of decent nutrients. Who knows? But don't worry, as the medieval day unfolds, many other peculiar gastronomic experiences await you. After all, if the dark bread and recycled soup haven't yet convinced you of the virtues of the modern world, the next step surely will. And as you let your spoon rest at the bottom of the empty bowl, taking a deep breath of that medieval survival aroma, you allow your gaze to drift into nothingness for a few seconds, slowly absorbing the culinary wisdom of that strange era. After all, as they say, it takes a lot of courage to face medieval food and still smile politely at the one who prepared it. Daylight filters through the gaps in the poorly aligned tavern planks, streaming in as golden beams that lazily dance in the suspended dust. You watch this silent spectacle with a still warm mug in your hands. But don't be fooled, the contents inside are far from water. In fact, if you asked any local of this era what they think of drinking pure water, you'd receive a confused look, perhaps even one of suspicion. Water, after all, is for the desperate, or the suicidal, or both. It's hard to accept, but in the 14th century, water was one of the greatest risks to your health. Lakes, wells, and rivers were often contaminated, with everything you'd prefer stayed far from your body. Human waste, animal carcasses, and tannery run off the infernal trio of medieval urban life turned the simple act of quenching your thirst into a bacteriological Russian roulette. So, people turned to what was available, fermented and marginally trustworthy, beer. And we're not talking about that fancy IPA with notes of tropical fruit and ornamental foam. No, sir. The everyday medieval beer was more like a thin alcoholic porridge of undefined color and interpretive flavor. It was called small beer and had a low alcohol content, specifically so it could be consumed like water. From breakfast to nightfall, adults and children rehydrated with this warm, murky liquid that at least didn't kill you as frequently. You take a cautious sip. It's slightly sour, somewhat earthy, and carries a fermented grain flavor that seems to have spent a bit too long in a somewhat suspect wooden barrel. Still, there's something comforting about this ancestral drink. Perhaps it's the fact that, against all odds, it kept entire generations alive, more or less. Interestingly, there are reports about the absurd amount of alcohol consumed daily by the average person in the Middle Ages. But it's controversial. Some scholars claim that adults drank between 3 to 4 liters of beer per day. Others believe that estimate is exaggerated, and that the reality was less boozy and more liquid. The truth, like many medieval things, lies somewhere between drunken myth and misinterpreted record. And since we're in the realm of questionable liquids, it's worth mentioning the medieval methods of purifying water for those who insisted on the risk. Boiling water was rare, due to lack of fuel or sheer ignorance. Instead, makeshift filters were used, with sand, charcoal, and in extreme cases, used cloth. That's right. You might be drinking water that passed through a recycled piece of underwear. A sensory delicacy, no doubt. For travelers, the situation was even more precarious. Often, they had to rely on dubious streams, whose waters seemed inviting. A strange itch appeared in the following days. Some carried flasks with aromatic herbs, not to cure diseases, but to mask the taste of what they preferred not to identify. The improvised infusion became a kind of desperation tea. As you take another sip of the small beer, wondering how anyone survived this for decades, an old man approaches your table. He talks about a time when a village well killed 7 people in a single summer. It was the water, of course, he says, as if commenting on the weather. Water's never to be trusted. Then, he walks away, like a local oracle with a scent of fermented barley. You stare at your mug in silence, reflecting on how fragile humanity's relationship with water once was. Today, you have filters, reusable bottles, sparkling mineral water, even that alkaline water trend. In the 14th century, a barrel of slightly sour beer and blind faith in natural fermentation. And so, between slow sips and diffuse thoughts, you begin to understand that medieval drinking was less of a choice and more a matter of survival. The irony is clear. In an age of disease, war, and mysticism, the purest liquid was also the most dangerous. As the sun slowly rises in the overcast sky, and the first footsteps of the day echo through the village, you lean back, allowing this strange fermented wisdom to settle gently into your mind. Beer might not cure everything, but in the medieval world, at least it didn't kill you quite as fast as water. The road stretches out before you like a ribbon of mud, dust, and hasty decisions. Your feet are already covered by a respectable layer of dirt. The sun beats down mercilessly, and your stomach begins to voice its discontent loudly. Traveling in the Middle Ages is not exactly what the romances suggest. No bucolic landscapes, accompanied by meals under ancient olive trees. The setting is more crunchy, in the dry sense, and also potentially infected. You stop under the sparse shade of a crooked tree, take the cloth backpack off your shoulders, and examine your provisions. A piece of bread hard enough to break teeth, a wedge of cheese of dubious odor, and a small piece of cured meat that's seen better days. Still, you smile at least. It's not recycled tavern soup. At least out here, the dominant smell is of warm earth and dry grass, not sweat and fermented onions. Medieval travelers' food had to be simple, resilient, and above all, forgotten by time. After all, there were no thermal bags or vacuum packaging. The bread was dry on purpose, as if it had been prepared not to be eaten, but to survive natural disasters. It was soaked in wine or beer before consumption, which helped make the experience less like chewing old wood. As for the cheesa, the glorious medieval Cheez-It was the star of the road. Made on small farms, aged for long periods, and often covered in ash or herbs, to keep it from turning into a mobile fungus colony. Some types could last weeks, even months, without refrigeration. That is, if you ignored the fact that the increasingly intense smell made it seem like it had already developed a personality of its own. It was, without a doubt, a travel companion more persistent than any friend. Curiously, food preservation methods in the Middle Ages included practices that today would be immediately rejected by any decent health authority. Among them, salting meat to the point where the texture resembled drum leather, sun-drying fruits and storing them in jars of honey, or covering food in melted animal fat to seal in freshness. All very ingenious if you forget for a moment that bacteria are incredibly stubborn creatures. Even more curious is the technique of preserving fish in barrels filled with vinegar and herbs. Something that made eating any medieval catch an unforgettable olfactory experience. And that's without mentioning eggs, buried in ashes, or submerged in lime water. Yes, medieval creativity knew no limits, especially when the goal was to prolong the shelf life of something edible until it ceased to be. Well, edible. But not everything was desperation and fermentation. Some communities mastered the use of herbs as natural preservatives. Rosemary, sage, and thyme weren't just there for flavor. They were believed to have purifying and protective properties. Did it actually work? Modern science shrugs. No one is entirely sure, though some of these practices have crossed centuries and somehow survived the test of taste and stomach. As you finish your beer-soaked bread and regard the final piece of cheese with the respect due to a living substance, you realize that eating on the move in the medieval world was an exercise in strategy, endurance, and faith. Faith that the food wouldn't fight back after being eaten. You return to the road, with the sun now lazily tilting in the sky, casting long shadows on the path ahead. Your belly full or at least occupied and your mind vaguely comforted by the thought that, even in the face of such adversity, medieval travelers found ways to keep going, chunk of cheese after chunk of cheese. And so, with the persistent smell of your snack clinging to your hands, you move on. There's much more to discover on this culinary journey, including the intriguing and slightly terrifying story of medieval meat, where the questions outnumber the answers and the taste. Well, let's save that for later. The village market is in full swing. Vendors' shouts echo between crooked stalls, competing with the lowing of oxen and the insistent chirping of chickens who apparently still don't know they're on the menu. You walk among baskets of bruised vegetables, sacks of grains, and rows of meats hanging on iron hooks, exposed to the sun without much ceremony. The aroma, an unsubtle blend of dried blood, smoke, and a faint touch of logistical despair. Meat, in the medieval world, is a finicky creature. Literally, it depends on many variables: climate, season, social status, and proximity to a weekly market. Eating meat daily was a privilege of well-fed nobles and clergy. For the rest of the population, it was an occasional luxury, celebrated with the intensity of a culinary miracle. And like all medieval miracles, it involved a certain degree of risk and mystery. You stop in front of an improvised butcher's stall, where a man in a grimy apron cuts pieces of something that could be pork, or maybe lamb or rand. Here lies the real thrill-something in between. The label meat was often applied quite liberally. In times of scarcity, small animals, wild game, or even questionable creatures could end up on the spit. And there are murky records suggesting that, in extreme situations, the line between food and taboo was ... flexible. The slaughtering process also leaves little room for romance. Animals were killed right at the market, hung on the spot, skinned before an indifferent audience. The lack of refrigeration meant everything had to be sold, cooked, or salted that same day. What was left, it was used in ways that would make any modern stomach beg for mercy. Blood became sausage, offal became stew, and the rest was boiled until it lost all anatomical identity. Interestingly, there are historical records of laws created to ensure the quality of meat sold in cities. In London, for example, it was forbidden to sell meat from sick animals. In Paris, there were regulations requiring meat to be sold at authorized stalls during specific hours. Enforcement, a matter of faith. After all, sanitary control was more of a suggestion than a practice. And inspections often relied on the goodwill of an official, who probably accepted a cut of meat as a bribe. You try a piece of roasted meat served in hard bread, with mustard made from crushed seeds and vinegar. The texture is uneven, a bit fibrous, but the flavor is strong and pronounced. Herbs and salt try to mask any hint of early decomposition. In a modern context, it would be the kind of dish served in a rustic restaurant with a lute soundtrack and bewildering prices. Here, it's just the everyday lunch of a resilient citizen. Speaking of mysteries, there's a persistent question in academic circles. Did medieval people frequently eat exotic meats? Swans, peacocks, and hedgehogs appear in noble banquets, described with pomp in illuminated manuscripts. But many scholars suspect these descriptions were more allegory than literal reality. A kind of medieval culinary fanfic. The truth, still debated. After all, reliable records are as rare as decent refrigeration in the summer of 1347. As you finish your meal, you look around with fresh perspective. Meat, at the time, was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of status, an object of desire, and also, inevitably, a bacterial roulette. Still, people kept eating, chewing, living. The sun begins to dip on the horizon, tinting the market in a soft, almost poetic golden hueth. You ignore the flies. And with that, we slowly move toward another fundamental part of the medieval diet: herbs. They not only seasoned food, but also promised miraculous cures, magical powers, and, occasionally, a quick passage to the afterlife. You now find yourself in the quiet back corner of a walled garden, the kind of place where the air feels thicker and more perfumed than necessary. Irregular flower beds sprawl between moss-covered stones, and small wooden labels with tortured Latin names try to bring order to the botanical chaos thriving there. This is the realm of medieval herbs universe, where coriander, rosemary, and belladonna share the same space, the same reverence, and sometimes the same side effects. The medieval world treated herbs with an almost mystical seriousness. In times when doctors prescribed bloodletting, and the concept of bacteria was still in philosophical hibernation, Plants were the people's mobile pharmacy. They cured fevers, warded off evil spirits, flavored broths, and depending on the dose caused intense hallucinations or discreet passings. You crouch and pick a sage leaf, crushing it between your fingers. The fresh scent invades your nostrils with an almost medicinal pungency. This simple leaf was considered a panacea, good for the liver, the heart, digestion, and, according to some particularly optimistic monks, even eternal longevity. Of course, provided it was used wisely. A detail not everyone remembered to observe. Interestingly, Herbal's illustrated manuscripts, compiling knowledge of medicinal plants, were both botanical records and semi-poetic grimoires. They combined observations on plant properties with instructions like gathered by the light of the full moon, when dew still sings on the leaves. Scientific precision, questionable. Lyrical aesthetics, impeccable. But herbs weren't just for soothing teas and ointments. They were constant presences in kitchens, from humble homes to castles. Rosemary and thyme were used to flavor strong meats and mask odors that were ... overly natural. Dill and mustard helped make pickles that, with luck, wouldn't explode after a few weeks. It was everyday alchemy at its most fragrant. You sit on a stone bench next to a basket of dried lavender and watch an elderly woman prepare a poultice. She murmurs something about repelling bad humors as she mixes herbs with goose fat. The consistency is questionable, the belief unwavering, and that says a lot about the mindset of the time. Some herbs, like rue and wormwood, were considered so potent they came with verbal warnings passed down through generations. Belladonna, with its dark green leaves and shiny black berries, was famous both for its pain-relieving properties and for its capacity to cause a poetic death. A touch of Gothic in Grandma's garden. And here lies the eternal dilemma of medieval botanical historiography. No one knows for sure whether many of these plants were used primarily as seasoning, as medicine, or as disguised weapons. The line was thin, and the dosage often based on oral traditions, guesses, or the advice of a monk with more faith than experience. You watch the sky change color, blue giving way to the amber of twilight. The breeze carries with it a mixture of aromas, crushed mint, chamomile, and something slightly metallic you choose not to identify. The garden begins to darken, but the fascination remains. In the silence between the leaves, you can almost hear the whispers of generations who trusted their health to these little green creatures, hoping their tea wouldn't turn into poison. You stand, feeling a strange calm settle over your body. Maybe it's the lavender's effect, or maybe just the relief of having survived another culinary medicinal experience of the Middle Ages. And with that, it's time to return to the Hall of the Powerful, where the food is more extravagant, the portions more generous, and the sense of reality a bit more flexible. The great hall of the castle is a theater of excess. You enter slowly, your footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor, and immediately feel the impact of the torch heat, the smell of roasted meat, and the constant hum of well-fed voices. Here, there are no lukewarm leftover soups or hardened bread. Here, there's stuffed pigeon with dried fruits, whole boar with an apple in its mouth, and birds breaded in gold, yes, gold not for taste, but because they could. You watch the servants hurrying back and forth in rushed choreography, balancing trays of carved fruits, freshly baked breads, and pitchers of wine so sweet they could be classified as dessert. Seated at the long table, the feudal lord surveys everything with a gaze that mixes boredom and superiority, as if the banquet were merely a dull pause between a failed crusade and a new tax collection. Food here is performance. It's not enough to taste, it must impress, intimidate, reaffirm status. A roasted swan is brought to the table with its feathers reassembled on the cooked skin, like a vain, false peacock. A dish of eels cut into intertwined, knot shapes, is displayed like an edible tapestry. And of course, there's the famous bear and jelly, served only on very special occasions, and whose recipes historians still regard with skepticism and a certain horror. Perhaps it never existed. Perhaps it was just a bad joke written on parchment. Table etiquette is as rigorous as it is absurd. There are rules on how to break bread with hands, but delicately, how to drink wine moderately, with contemplative pauses, and even how to burp in total silence, like a polite ghost. The younger ones are watched by strict tutors, ensuring no one uses a dagger to scratch an ear or dips fingers into the communal salta, social crime akin to spitting on the altar. You're served a plate of venison wrapped in aromatic leaves, with a thick sauce made from wine, spices, and apparently every fruit known to the continent. The flavor is intense, almost baroque. You chew slowly, while beside you, an older man tries to convince the table that the secret to perfect digestion is drinking diluted vinegar after dinner. No one seems convinced, but everyone pretends to be. Etiquette, after all. And here comes the most delightfully disconcerting curiosity of the night. At some noble banquets, the dishes served were, in fact, alive. Frogs jumping from hollow pies, birds flying out of fake deserts, even tiny pigs dressed in sugar armor. It was the perfect mix of food and entertainment, as if a culinary reality show had invaded the Middle Ages with very questionable sets. Of course, the records of these practices are, at best, murky. Many scholars believe some of these descriptions are hyperbole from overly enthusiastic chroniclers, or exaggerated versions of a particularly creative dinner. Others argue that yes, there was a time when the noble table was a stage for gastronomic spectacles, with a high risk of ingredient escape. You take a sip of dark wine, feel the sugar hit your tongue hard, and the alcohol rise slowly to your head. Around you, the laughter grows louder, the stories more improbable. The music, played by minstrels in a corner, rises and falls like a river full of twists, as the night stretches beneath a ceiling of stone and tapestries. The feudal lord's dinner is more than a meal, it's a power manifesto. An opera of meat and wine performed before the eyes of those hungry for wealth. And you, a temporary observer of this universe, begin to understand that abundance is also a kind of mask. Behind the exotic dishes and elaborate rules, the same uncertainty pulses that haunts the peasants with their dry bread and leftover broths. Here, abundance is theatrical, insecurity discreet. With the last bite of dinner still perfuming your palate, it's time to move on to another essential ingredient of medieval life: salt. The white gold, the invisible currency that defined borders, sparked wars, and preserved that fish you wish you hadn't eaten. You now walk among piles of linen sacks and wooden barrels in a dark, cool storeroom. Light filters in timid beams through the cracks of high windows, illuminating floating particles that blend with the fine white dust scattered across the floor. It's not flour, it's salt. So much salt. Enough to make you understand, with all your senses, why this mineral powder was once more valuable than gold. Literally, in the Middle Ages, salt was far more than a seasoning. It was a symbol of power, an economic foundation, a political weapon, and often the fine line between food preservation and accelerated decay. Without it, there was no salted meat, no cured fish, and no hope of keeping food alive for more than 2 days, in a world without refrigerators, without ice, and with a lot of luck. It was cutting-edge technology, packed into crystals. You crouch to pick up a small chunk of coarse salt. It's rough, almost sharp to the touch, and has that slightly dull shine of something that looks simple, but isn't, and indeed, it wasn't. Medieval governments imposed sky-high taxes on salt. In France, there was the infamous gabelle, a levy that caused so much popular unrest it would be cited centuries later as one of the causes of the French Revolution. Yes, salt had the power to topple regimes, and it still does just as modern diets. But beyond taxation, there was control. Cities guarded their salt depots with near-religious vigilance. Smugglers crossed forests with sacks hidden under their cloaks, evading patrols that treated illegal salt with the same seriousness reserved for real criminals. A piece of salt could buy favors, pay off debts, or be traded for dried meat in a rural market. And of course, in times of war, it was common to see soldiers looting salt stores with as much zeal as they did temples. In the ecclesiastical world, salt also played a role. It was used in purification rites, blessings, and even in pacts. A contract sealed with salt was seen as eternal, unbreakable, a mineral symbol of human bond durability. In some cultures, spilling salt on the ground was considered a bad omen. In others, it was as serious as a direct insult to the patron saints of the home. You taste a small crystal on the tip of your tongue. It's strong, intense, direct like medieval life itself. An element that speaks little, but decides much. And its use in food. That was, in a way, almost incidental. Yes, it seasoned, but its main goal was preservation. Meats were soaked in brine for days, sometimes weeks. Fish were covered in generous layers of coarse salt and hung in storerooms to dry, like flags of a salty culinary empire. And here comes one of those fascinating academic questions. How much salt was actually needed to keep an army supplied during a campaign? There are murky records, contradictory accounts, and numbers that don't add up. Some historians estimate tons per month. Others say much of what was called salt was actually mixed with sand, lime, or flour just to fool the inattentive. The result, no one knows for sure. And perhaps we never will. As you walk through the warehouse, your steps muffled by that white floor. You realize that salt is one of the few truly universal ingredients of the Middle Ages. Rich or poor, monk or warrior, everyone depended on it. It was the bare minimum, the base flavor, the link between yesterday and tomorrow of food. Without it, the medieval world would have smelled much worse. And with that mineral taste still on your tongue, it's time to think about something that, ironically, was almost absent from the common medieval diet. Sugar. Our next stop will be a sweet, sticky dive into the desserts of the elite, where honey, dried fruits, and, occasionally, refined sugar created what was known as pleasure, and sometimes, penance. You step into a small castle kitchen, the kind of space that feels more like a warm, fragrant cave. The ceiling is low, the windows tiny, and the stone countertop is covered with ceramic bowls, wooden spoons, and neatly chaotic piles of dried fruits, honey, seeds, and something white, rare, expensive, and guarded like a sacred relic, sugar. In the Middle Ages, sugar was so rare, it circulated in hard blocks, wrapped in cloth and kept under lock and key. It was imported through far-off caravans and ships that braved pirates, plagues, and the era's general nautical incompetence. It wasn't just an ingredient, it was a statement of status. A lump of sugar was the medieval equivalent of flaunting a pearl necklace at a flea market. You approach and watch a young cook grind sugar with a mortar and pestle. The process is slow, meticulous, almost ritualistic. Next to her, someone stirs a thick syrup made with dates, wine, and spices. The air smells of figs boiled with cinnamon, provoking a mix of longing and lightheadedness. Here, desserts are extravagant, and occasionally unsettling. Yes, there were apple pies, nut cakes, and flavored preserves. But there were also bean sweets, sweetened blood puddings, and fritters made with animal fat, honey, and breadcrumbs. All carefully molded into shapes representing animals, saints, or sins. A medieval banquet wasn't complete without an entremet, a dish served between courses that could be anything from a sugar sculpture to a sung poem accompanied by flute. Curiously, sugar was considered medicinal. Monks and doctors recommended it for colds, headaches, and ironically, digestive issues caused by too much meat. There was even a general belief that sugar, when combined with Eastern spices, warmed the body's humors and elevated the spirit. A convenient excuse for another spoonful of rose jam. You try a piece of almond tart sweetened with honey. The texture is surprisingly delicate, but the flavor is dense, complex, almost exhausting. Here, the idea of a light dessert didn't exist. Eating something sweet was an event, a dinner's climax, and also a test of dental endurance. After all, toothbrushes were still in their infancy on the hygiene timeline. And, as always, there are uncertainties. Many recipes were passed down orally or recorded in nearly indecipherable codes, with measurements like a handful or enough to make the oven sweat. Modern scholars try to reconstruct these medieval delights based on guesswork, imperfect translations, and a good dose of intuition. The result, sometimes an unforgettable delicacy, other times an experiment that ends up in the trash modern, of course. As you walk among the ovens and pots, you realize how sugar turned a meal into a performance. It was the theatrical conclusion of a ritual, and for many, an experience close to the sacred. Of course, most people never tasted refined sugar in their lifetime. The common sweetener was honey, ubiquitous, versatile, ancient. And even that honey wasn't always pure. In hard times, it was mixed with flour, beet syrup, or even wax. But that didn't stop anyone from enjoying fried dough dipped in the sweet blend. Especially during religious festivals, when even the poorest could taste something resembling a happy ending. You take a final sip of spiced honey wine, feel the warmth rise through your throat, and think it might be time to return to something more solid, more, seasoned. Spices, after all, were another kind of medieval extravagance. Pepper, nutmeg, ginger, all used with disproportionate enthusiasm and, let's say, creative applications. The air in the pantry you find yourself in now is warm, dry, and saturated with an intense fragrance. It's like stepping into an ancient chest of culinary treasures, except instead of gold and jewels, there are cloth sacks full of dark grains, twisted roots, dried flowers, and tiny seeds that exude aromas from places you've never seen. Pepper, cinnamon, clove, saffron, nutmeg. Names that today sound familiar, but in the Middle Ages evoked images of distant kingdoms, exotic dangers, and mystical promises. A small wooden container, carefully labeled with incomprehensible symbols. Inside are tiny dark spheres, black peppercorns, considered so valuable in medieval Europe that they were sometimes used as currency. Literally, one could pay rent with pepper, or buy a guard's silence with a few grams of nutmeg. The fascination with spices was so intense, it justified maritime expeditions, international treaties, and a disconcerting amount of spilled tea, or rather, blood. Italian, Arab, and Indian merchants formed a web of trade routes that took months, sometimes years, to complete. And all of that so, in the end, a European cook could use half a spoonful of ginger to season a fish stew of questionable taste. You watch a cook prepare a typical feast dish. Lamb cooked with raisins, vinegar, saffron, and cinnamon. The aroma is intriguing. The flavor, confusing, yet curious. Medieval seasoning logic completely ignored the modern concept of contrast and balance. Here, everything was used at once, with almost childlike enthusiasm. Food had to be memorable, not necessarily coherent. And it wasn't just in the kitchen. Spices had medicinal and spiritual uses. Pepper was recommended to improve circulation, cinnamon to treat colds, and clove to calm the nerves. Some recipes mixed herbs with aromatic resins and powdered gemstones. Yes, you heard that right, powdered sapphire. The medieval palate was not only bold, it was moderately abrasive. There were also less reliable applications. A 13th century medical manual, for instance, recommends a nutmeg infusion with goat's milk to ward off evil spirits and attract prophetic dreams. Another swears that a paste of saffron and horse urine cures kidney pain. Medicine and cuisine, as always, dancing side by side in a strange and stumbling ball. Modern scholars try to determine how frequent this consumption really was, or whether it was merely fantasy from impressionable scribes. Some argue that spices were reserved for the elite. Others suggest that, through local routes, diluted versions of these seasonings circulated even among the poor. The truth remains imprecise, like nearly everything in the Middle Ages, wrapped in parchment mist and fermentation. You take a pinch of cinnamon and rub it between your fingers. The scent brings a sweet, almost Christmas-like memory. But there, in that time, it was used in savory dishes, stews, rustic breads, wines, and even cosmetics. It was spice and perfume, medicine and mysticism, a symbol of status, and, at the same time, of hope. Hope that maybe life could have more flavor than misery. As you leave the pantry, the fragrance of spices still clings to you, and you begin to understand that, for medieval people, food wasn't just sustenance. It was art, alchemy, superstition. A way to navigate an uncertain world, using the palate as a compass. And now, with your tongue still warmed by clove, and your head spinning between saffron and doubt, we move into a realm where food and faith collide, fasting, a sacred practice that forced even the most gluttonous nobles to reinvent their diets, or bend the rules with disconcerting creativity. You awaken to the sound of bells, not those of the tavern nor the marketplace, but the monastery bells. It's a fasting day. Food, like nearly everything in the medieval world, is also dictated by sacred calendars and strict precepts. Today, no meat, no butter, no eggs, no milk, nothing that has warm blood. The body must purify itself, tame its desires, become as light as the soul, striving for salvation. In theory, in practice, well, the medieval human, like the modern one, was creative when it came to sidestepping inconvenient rules with elegance and a certain degree of theological boldness. You're in a monastic refectory. Monks, in complete silence, chew modest portions of lentils, dark bread, and a roasted fish that resembles a small leather pillow. Yes, fish is permitted, because, in some way that involves divine logic and flexible interpretations of sacred texts, fish is not meat. They're aquatic creatures, and therefore, exempt from the dietary condemnation of Fridays and Lent. But medieval cunning didn't stop at tilapia. You overhear whispers about recipes for almond milk, an ingenious invention to simulate animal milk during forbidden days. There are also fish eggs, substituting chicken eggs, butterless cakes, vegetable cheeses, and other small frauds with pious appearances. There are even records of monks who, on special occasions, cooked beavers under the argument that, since they lived in water, they could be considered fish. The logic is flawless, the flavor, probably less so. You try a thin-grained soup, seasoned with herbs and a touch of vinegar. It's simple, warm, strangely comforting. You realize that fasting, in this context, doesn't exactly mean going hungry. It means eating differently, eating with a symbolic weight that hovers over each spoonful, an exercise in moderation, or in religious theatrics, depending on your perspective. In the homes of the wealthy, fasting existed too, of course, but with far more sophistication. Specialized cooks created entire banquets without meat, but with exotic ingredients, spiced fish pies, candied fruit desserts, nut-stuffed breads, and crustacean soups that felt more like celebration than sacrifice. It was what they called a penitent feast. Contradictions served in silver bowls. Historians still debate how rigorously were fasts actually followed. Some say most people respected the restrictions strictly, more out of fear of hell than conviction. Others believe that deviations were common, though discreet. The chronicles aren't conclusive. The records are ambiguous. The truth, as always, slips off the edge of the plate. You watch an elderly woman pray before eating a plate of dried fish with rye bread. Her face is calm, serene. For her, fasting is a moment of surrender. For the neighbor, discreetly chewing a piece of pork hidden in bread, it's merely a technical obstacle. Medieval faith had its shortcuts, too. The sun begins to set, tinting the sky with that golden hue of successful penitence. You rise from the table, feeling the lightness of the meal and the symbolic weight of the ritual. It's curious how, even in such distant times, food remains a silent language that reveals far more than taste alone can convey. And now, with a stomach full of faith and beans, it's time to face the darker side of food history: hunger. Yes, it too was part of daily life. And not as a spiritual metaphor, but as a real, harsh presence that forged survivors and inspired desperate recipes. The field before you is silent. The earth, dry and hard, cracks beneath your feet. The wind blows, but moves nothing but dust. It's a bad year. The harvest has failed. The grains rotted before ripening. The rains came too late. The rats arrived too early. You look around and see gaunt faces, downcast eyes, empty hands. There's no bread on the table, no soup in the pot. There is hunger, the kind that aches, that hollows the belly, and stretches the days. In the Middle Ages, hunger wasn't a rare accident. It was a constant possibility on the horizon, like a gray cloud that never goes away. A bad summer, a nearby war, a crop plague, and everything unraveled. The agricultural economy was fragile, food storage was rudimentary, and the roads, when not overrun by thieves, were impassable with mud or snow. In short, if the wheat failed, there was no plan B. You approach a woman scraping tree bark with a dull knife. She's preparing a kind of rustic flour by mixing dried bark shavings with water and ground roots. Then she molds small discs and bakes them over hot stones. These are famine breads. Dark, bitter, hard as unkept promises. They're eaten slowly, more as a ritual than for pleasure. In extreme times, human creativity revealed its most tragic face. There are records of soups made with grass, bread baked with sawdust, porridge made from earth mixed with animal fat. In some regions of northern Europe, they made a type of biscuit from algae and dried mud. Survival here was quite literally chewing the world. Interestingly, there were specific recipes for such periods. Crisis foods were passed down through generations with the solemnity of a family tradition, but with the bitter taste of necessity. The hermit's bread, for example, was made with beet leaves, vinegar, and acorn flour. Oat porridge was diluted to stretch for a week, even if it lost all texture and dignity. Even in monasteries, where there was supposedly more stability, supplies could run out. Many monks cultivated their own gardens, but when the land failed, they fasted more than the liturgy required. Hunger was democratic. It affected rich and poor alike, but, as always, with different consequences. The nobles fasted with aged cheese and watered-down wine. The peasants fasted with nothing. There was also a symbolic side to hunger. Many religious figures saw it as natural penance, a form of forced purification. Saint Angela of Foligno, for instance, described visions after long periods eating nothing but bread and water. Others simply fainted in the middle of Mass. The line between mystical ecstasy and metabolic collapse was, let's say, thin, and the records, well, they're scattered. Some chronicles describe entire years of great hunger with vague details and inflated numbers. There's debate about how frequent these events truly were, about their reach and impact. Some scholars argue that while catastrophic famines were episodic, moderate scarcity was so constant, it became invisible in the records. You sit on a stone at the edge of the field, slowly chewing a piece of acorn bread. It's dry, bitter, and crumbles like sand. But there's something moving about it, the stubbornness to keep eating, even when everything says it's not worth it. The medieval table, after all, wasn't just a place for meals, it was a field of resistance. And if hunger shaped the everyday, then moments of festivity came like bursts of light in the dark. Banquets, fairs, festivities, occasions, when food ceased to be mere survival and became spectacle, excess, collective catharsis. The village square is unrecognizable. Colorful flags flutter between windows, drums beat in an uneven rhythm, and the smoke rising from roasting pits draws cheerful spirals in the gray sky. It's festival day. Hunger, for a moment, has been suspended. Medieval life, marked by privation and repetition, bursts into color, music, and, most importantly, food. Lots of food. You walk slowly among wooden stalls covered with stretched cloths. A man shouts, offering wild game pies. A woman turns a spit with roasting lamb until the skin crackles like dry firewood. Children run with sticky slices of sweetbread, and old men chew caramelized apples with a concentration bordering on the sacred. Medieval festivals, religious, civic, or simply convenient, were essential escape valves. For a day or two, the world turned upside down. The laborer ate like a noble, the priest drank like a peasant, and the class system, though briefly, dissolved under barrels of beer and bowls of wheat porridge with dried fruits. You sit on a communal bench, surrounded by improvised dishes, savory pies, fritters fried in pork fat, cheeses wrapped in leaves, and even a platter with what appears to be fish. Inside a pig. It's the famous medieval turducken, only with more improvisation and far fewer sanitary guidelines. The games are also part of the feast. At some festivals, food was served disguised. Clay pies filled with real vegetables, desserts that looked like meat, and of course, the classic hollow pies filled with live birds, which flew out when the first slice was cut. A spectacle that, depending on the audience, sparked laughter or lifelong trauma. Nearby, a group of masked men performs a symbolic battle between winter and spring. At the end, they hand out hard sun-shaped biscuits. In another corner, there's a contest to see who can eat the most meat pastries in the shortest time. The prize is a jug of wine and the likely temporary loss of dignity. But it's not all about food. There's music, dancing, and a kind of improvised puppet theater telling, in subtly obscene fashion, the tale of a monk who fell in love with a cook. The crowd laughs, perhaps because they know that, between love and food, the medieval heart had little time to choose. It's easy to be swept away by the general joy. But like everything in the Middle Ages, even abundance had a dark side. These banquets, as festive as they were, also hid excess, waste, and inequality. Some noble feasts featured literally hundreds of dishes, banquets, where more food was displayed than actually eaten. It was more theater than sustenance. Modern scholars debate whether these popular feasts were truly as plentiful as records suggest. Some believe the accounts were romanticized, that much of the food was split into tiny portions among many. Others argue that even if only for a single day, eating to exhaustion was a legitimate form of collective catharsis, a celebration of life amidst so much uncertainty. You finish a slice of honey cake and lean back on the bench. The sun sets behind the stone houses, and the party goes on. There's something deeply human in this organized chaos, in this impulse to transform flour, fat, and laughter into resistance. And when the music slows, when torches are lit, and the last cup's emptied, you feel it's time to return to the place where it all began, the tavern, because, in the end, it's always there that the stories conclude, begin again. The door creaks again. You step inside. The tavern is fuller than the first time you saw it, but the smell remains the same. A perfume of old beer, grilled meat, fermented sweat, and hot bread that, by some alchemical miracle, now seems more pleasant. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's the fact that, after so many questionable meals, the familiarity of the medieval tavern feels a bit like home. You find your place on a still damp wooden bench and observe. Every corner of the hall seems to stage a microcosm of life. There are merchants arguing prices with voices half drowned in wine, peasants dozing with heads on plates, musicians tuning instruments as if each note could buy one more drink, and of course, potential brawls linger in every sideways glance. Nothing too aggressive, just the natural tension of a place where everyone has an unresolved story. The tavern wasn't just a rest stop. It was the unofficial forum, the lay confessional, the hub of gossip and conspiracy. Here, decisions were made, marriages arranged, debts renegotiated and, frequently, entirely forgotten after the fourth mug. It was where one mourned a friend's death and toasted to life with the same cup. You glance at the bar. Behind it, the innkeeper serves beer, with the dexterity of someone who has poured half her life into barrels. She knows every patron by name, and by outstanding debt. And if there's anyone here who deserves respect, it's her, because no one survives years of medieval clientele without mastering the art of patience and calculated silence. The stories that circulate in the tavern are fragments of a larger world. A man claims he saw a chicken lay a square egg. Another swears a traveler brought pink salt from the east that cures heartache. In the darkest corner, an old man murmurs that he once saw a pig cross a bridge alone, to the sound of flutes. The truth, entirely irrelevant. The purpose of these stories is not to inform, but to entertain, to comfort, to create a sense of belonging. And there are, of course, games. Dice made of bone, cards with images of saints or sinners, depending on the round, contests of strength, of drinking endurance, or who can eat the most dried fish without taking a sip. The tavern is also the world's first adult amusement park, with less safety and more digestive risks. It's curious to think that, for many historians, records about taverns remain scarce. The sources are partial accounts, moralist literature, or formal complaints from religious authorities who despised these places. Many tried to erase or downplay the role of taverns in society, but they endured. Because, deep down, where there are people, there's a need for a place to eat, drink, and forget for a while. You order another mug. The beer is the same as always. Murky, warm, with a slightly metallic taste. But now, it feels almost sophisticated, because now you understand that this drink is the link between strangers, the catalyst for conversation, the universal language of collective exhaustion. And as you look around, more attentively, you realize everything is connected. The hard bread of hunger, the exaggerated banquet of the feast, the recycled breakfast soup, everything in Zand often begins here. At the shared table, on the improvised plate, in the cracked cup passed from hand to hand. And now, as the night wears on, with candles dripping wax onto old wood and the music growing slower, you feel ready for the final toast. For the slow, warm farewell to this world of coarse flavors, strong aromas, and fermented memories. The tavern slowly falls asleep. The sound of voices fades into a murmur, like leaves dragged by a weary wind. The smoke from the torches rises lazily toward the ceiling of dark beams, dissolving like the end of a dream. Outside, the moon discreetly lights the stone street. In here, everything hushes, and you're still there, sitting in your corner, with a nearly empty mug in your hands, and a strange feeling in your chest, a mix of fullness, awe, and that slight dizziness only history or warm beer can cause. You look around one last time. That old man sleeping with his mouth open, the young woman wiping the table with a cloth that long gave up being clean, the sound of an out-of tune lute playing a melody that seems to want to lull the whole world to sleep. Everything moves in slow motion. Everything breathes at a gentler rhythm, as if time itself has sat down, had a drink, and dozed off too. And then you realize, this world you've traveled through thin broths and golden banquets, noisy feasts and solemn fasts was not just a journey through flavors. It was a human crossing. Because medieval food, rough, creative, sometimes absurd, was also an expression of survival, of ritual, of affection disguised as rye bread. You remember the morning soup, with its mysterious chunks and honest warmth. The traveling cheese, persistent like a loyal friend. The meat, ambiguous and theatrical. The shy sugar, hidden under layers of symbolism. And the salt, silently binding it all. Each dish was an invitation to remain, even in times of uncertainty. Uncertainty, in fact, was always present. Scholars still debate what was truly eaten, what was exaggerated, what was myth. But like all that lives in collective memory, perhaps what matters isn't the exact dish, but the act of breaking bread, the gesture of sharing, of storytelling, of chewing through time as it passes. You raise your mug one last time, not to toast to health, wealth, or victory, but to the resilience of those who ate what they had, celebrated when they could, and Devon and hunger invented flavor. A toast to those who turned tree bark into bread, fish into penance, and soup into home. Outside, the modern world awaits, with its full fridge, precise recipes, and delivery apps. But here, in this final moment, you're just one more at the stone table, hearing the echo of laughter, smelling the roast, and letting sleep come slowly, like a thick stew wrapping the body from the inside out. The hearth's fire dims slowly, the last spoon rests, and the medieval night, at last, swallows all sound, as if to say, "That's enough for today. Sleep well."